Hello, global gardeners, and welcome to another edition of Your Gardening Week Live. I think we have a good one today. This is one of those topics. When do you start your seeds? And as I've already seen in some of the comments, many of us make the mistake of starting our seeds too early. When we're getting started with this whole gardening thing, we want to start our seeds, but we don't always have the information we need, and we start them too early. You make that mistake at least once. Some of us make it many times over the course of years as we try new things. So today, we'll help answer your questions as to when to start the seeds that you want to grow. So nice to see everybody here. Lots of people checking in. Shout out to Riverdale Gardens, who aren't always able to join us, but they're here today because it's Martin Luther King National Holiday here in the States. And I know we've got some viewers today because of the holiday. So welcome to those of you who aren't normally able to make a live stream. And I hope you can participate. Ask your questions, give your answers, share your stories. That's what this is all about today. So let's go ahead and jump right into the idea of seed starting and how it fits in our gardening calendar. I like to break seed starting down into three basic periods of the year. We have that time in winter, late winter, early spring, when we're starting our seeds indoors to go out into our spring and summer garden. That's the first phase. Phase two is when we're actually starting plants from seed directly outdoors for our spring and summer garden. And phase three is when we start seeds either indoors or outdoors in summer for our fall garden. Now, for most of us, those are the periods of the year. Those three times will really encompass what we need to know about seed starting. But I know for those of you that are in very warm regions, particularly those of you in Florida, for instance, you'll actually have a fourth period of the year when you can start seeds and grow them during your winter period. So I'll be primarily focusing on the three times of year because they're interchangeable with the winter period. There really isn't that much different about it. So that's the basic idea behind when we start our seeds. But of course, it's not that simple because each plant is going to require a different time when we start those seeds. So I want to go ahead and start off before we get into the in-depth information. Pat Patrick, thank you so much for that super chat. Last year's goal was 100% from seed, no store-bought prices, looking for more shared experience on seed starting tips. So glad you're here. You're always here, Pat. You're always a great supporter, and I appreciate it. And I think that's actually a really good goal. I did that last year, and the year before, it was still a new year for my garden, so I did buy a few plants. But last year, everything I grew, to include wildflowers, perennial flowers, herbs, and of course my vegetable garden, I started from seed myself, either indoors or outdoors. So you can definitely do it. And I think that's a nice goal, not just for last year, but this year and all those years ahead. Start from seed. You can save so much money when you start by buying the seeds, then growing from seeds. Then if you save the seeds, you can garden for the rest of your life without ever having to spend money on seeds again. And that's actually my goal. That's what I'm working toward. And that's why I try so many varieties and so many different things, is to try to find the plants I like best, that do best in my garden, and then save those seeds. And in the future, be able to continue gardening and just not worry about that expense at all. Because when you start making your own compost and you grow your own plants and you save your own seeds, you can really get the cost of gardening down to almost nothing. So let's go ahead and break this down into some of the specifics. So we've got the three basic time periods on the calendar when we're going to be looking at starting seeds. And so for many of us on this winter's day, and I know much of the United States is being pounded by snow and cold right now, it's a great time of year to start thinking about starting the seeds for your spring and summer garden. But just because it's cold and snowy outside and you've got time to do it does not mean that right now is the right time. And so here's some basic guidelines, and you can use this information as a starting point. Look at the plants you're growing. Try to learn more about the plants that you're growing from seed, and then figure out how long is that plant going to take from when I start the seed until I can harvest that plant. And so some plants take a very long time to grow. So for instance, peppers take about 8 to 10 weeks generally from seed until the plant is big enough to start the clock. And then from that point, depending on the pepper, it's going to be another 80 or 90, maybe 100 days before the pepper is ready to harvest. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you're spending 2 months just to get the plant big enough to start growing. And then when you start the clock, it's going to take another 3 months before that plant produces. So if you want to grow peppers in your garden, it's going to take 5 months of warm weather because peppers need warm soil. If you live in an area where you've got at least 5 months out of the year where the soil is warm, where you get lots of sun, and you got the time to grow, you can actually grow peppers from seed directly sown outdoors. But if you don't have 5 straight months of good warm weather, then you've got to start your peppers indoors. And that's why most of us will start our peppers indoors. The same holds true with tomatoes and eggplants. They have just such a long season that you really need to start the plant indoors. But if I were in Florida or southern Alabama or areas of Texas, I would consider starting my pepper seeds directly outdoors and not taking the time to do it indoors. It's a perfectly viable option. Then you look at other type of plants that take almost no time at all to grow. So look at radishes, look at lettuce, look at spinach. Those type of plants will take between 30 and 60 days from when you put the seed in the soil until you are harvesting those leaves. It really doesn't gain you a lot to start seeds like that indoors because you can just direct sow them outside and they're going to grow so quickly that why waste the time of starting indoors and then hardening off and then transplanting and then waiting for them to grow? Just direct sow them. There are also a lot of plants that don't transplant well. You can grow plants like squash and watermelon ahead of time, but they really don't like their roots disturbed much. So if you grow those kind of plants ahead of time, it's usually best to grow them in one of those biodegradable kind of pots, like that's made out of cow manure or cocoa coir or peat. And so you put those type of plants in that biodegradable pot, and then you can transplant them outside. But I don't do a lot of that. Even my short season allows me enough time to direct sow my squash and my zucchini and the specific types of melons that I can grow. And so these are the kind of things to start looking at when you're trying to figure out the best time to start your plants. Does the plant require a long season, so you've got to get a head start indoors, or does the plant grow so quickly that you can direct sow it? You also take those two types of plants as you look forward into your fall garden and decide, Do you need to start them ahead of time, or can you direct sow them? So that's kind of the umbrella idea of looking at the types of plants and then deciding whether you're going to start them indoors or whether you're going to start them outdoors. So let's shift to a shout out to Patricia Barr. Just glad to be here. I'm glad you're here too. Happy gardening, everyone. Thanks as always for all you do. I'm so glad to do it. And thank you so much for that super chat. I'm going to scroll down a little bit just to catch up with the comments as I proceed. And so those basic guidelines of does the plant grow quickly or does the plant grow slowly will get you started with when do I start my plants? And do I start them indoors or outdoors? Now, this is where it starts getting into the problem that some of you, as I've seen in the comments, have suffered from. You know the plant needs to be started ahead of time, like tomatoes and peppers, but you don't know exactly when they should be started. So you have a cold, snowy day in January and you decide you're going to start your tomatoes. And I went to my garden club meeting a couple days ago, and a pretty experienced gardener was telling everybody, because I asked the question, he was telling everybody that he had already started his tomato seeds. Now, a great way to start to determine when is to read the seed packet, because the good seed packets from the good seed companies will almost always tell you when to start the seeds. And tomato packets almost universally will say to start the seeds 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. Well, here in Colorado, our last frost date is still 4 months away. So we're about 12 weeks before our last frost date, and he's already starting his tomatoes. This is a very common mistake. You've got the time, you're not outside, and you want to start. The issue you confront is how big a plant do you want? If you want to grow a tomato plant that is 3 feet tall, which can easily be done in a 4-month period, do you really want to be transplanting a 3-foot tall plant out into your garden? This is one of those things that also comes from experience. You're going to find that there's an ideal size for the plants that go outside. And that size of plant tends to be about 6 to 8 inches in height. The roots are just starting to develop, and so a plant that size you can transplant. Then it takes off in your wonderful garden soil and grows and will give you the harvest you're looking for. If the plant is too big and now you transplant it, you run into that risk of root damage. And so now you transplant. The roots have been damaged in transplant. The roots in a pot may not even be enough to be supporting a plant that size. You damage the roots, you put it in the ground, and the plant is going to suffer because it's going to devote its energy first to producing new roots to support the growth that's already on the plant. And only then will it start growing new leaves and flowers and fruit and all the rest of it. So, though I think this guy is jumping forward as a gardener to start seeds, 4 months for tomatoes is just too early. That 6 to 8 week guidance is there for a reason, because all these seed companies and most of us gardeners have learned that that is about the right amount of time. You'll see that for peppers, it's generally 8 to 10 weeks. And that'll give you, in most cases, about a 6-inch plant. In my area, because our season is a little bit shorter, and I want to get my peppers to change color for the harvest, I tend to do it more 10 to 12 weeks early because I want to put out more like an 8-inch plant into my garden. One that is already a little bit bigger, a little more robust, and that should flower shortly after I put it into the ground. And this is an important consideration. I kind of just touched on it a little while ago. But when you look at a seed packet and it tells you the days to harvest, those days to harvest are from when you put the plant out in your garden. It takes into account that 6 to 8 weeks or that 8 to 10 weeks, and then the clock starts. And so you have to build this all into your planning. So how do we really choose a good anchor point to figure out what dates work best? If you read the seed packets, they'll tell you to base these numbers on your last frost date. And if you don't know your last frost date, just do a simple search. You can do it right now in another window. Just type in last frost date 4 and type in the name of your city or town, and it'll tell you what your last frost date is or give you a link to a site that will tell you what your last frost date is. So that's the way the seed companies work. You have your last frost date, and then you work backwards. And so my last frost date is May 18th. And all I have to do is open up my calendar, and you can do this electronically. I still like to use a paper calendar, but open up your calendar and write whatever your last frost date is on the calendar. For me, it's May 18th. And if I'm going to start my tomatoes 6 weeks before that date, I just back up 6 weeks on the calendar and write start tomato seeds indoors today. For my peppers, I do the same thing, only I back it up 10 or 12 weeks and write on the calendar, start pepper seeds today. And so look at the packets, go to your calendar, and write on the calendar. This is another one of those things that leads to the problem of starting seeds too early, is we get in this mindset of it's time to start my seeds. And so you start all your seeds on the same day. That's what we do when we're outside planting in a summer garden, right? You put all of your seeds in all of your beds on the same day. And that makes perfect sense for a summer garden because you're out there, you're starting on that day, the soil is warm, the weather is warm, you're going to do it. Makes perfect sense when you're doing it outdoors. But you have to stop and slow down and analyze each individual plant when you're going to do it indoors. And so during the seed starting season that many of us are fast approaching or might already be in, you might be starting seeds today, and then in a week you would be starting different seeds, and in 2 weeks beyond that you would be starting even more seeds. And all of them will be different because you looked at the seed packet and you backed off on the calendar to determine when you're going to start your seeds. So that's the basic guideline. We'll get into some more specifics. Let me get to some of the questions and we'll see what you all are saying. YD says, started my peppers and tomatoes and they can usually go in the ground March to early April. Last frost date is January 19th. Had a cold December, but now we already in the 60s with no frost in sight. Good for you. And that actually raises a really good point because we've talked about this in recent weeks. Even though you might have the temperatures to have plants outside during this time of year in the northern hemisphere, there's not enough light to really support the plants. And so this is an important factor. I've talked about soil temperature before. Soil temperature is really, really important when it comes to those summer crops. The squash, the tomatoes, the peppers, they really need a good warm soil to do well. So you should be aware of your soil temperature. But light is definitely a consideration. For most of us, we really don't think about it that much because we're not going to be putting our plants in until our last frost date, and our last frost date is in May, and there's going to be enough sunlight during the day to support the plants. But during the middle of winter, you may have the good temperatures to start your plants, but not enough light. So I really like what this comment, YD, that you've got the peppers and tomatoes to go in the ground in March and April, even though you've already got your early frost or last frost date, which will be here in just a couple days. So light is definitely a good consideration. Shout out to Matthew C117, new member on the Gardner Scott channel. So welcome to the membership, and start taking advantage of those perks that are coming your way. Okay, scrolling down again. Let's see. Rudimental Gardening is here. Shout out to you. Jonan Johnson is here, being active, of course. I like to see that as well. You guys are just so wonderful talking back and forth. Carla's saying, it's hard not to get ahead of myself, but I'm looking at an expanse of snow out there, and currently it's 29 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about a -1 Celsius. So definitely cold. I'm in the opposite mode right now. We're supposed to be about 60 degrees Fahrenheit today, almost 16 degrees Celsius. And so I'm in seed starting mode and want to get downstairs and get my seeds going and get the calendar all finished and buy some more seeds that I need to buy, all that stuff. But it's 60 degrees outside. So now I'm trying to change horses and figure out what I'm going to do outside because the weather is so good. So this is just such a crazy time of year for so many of us, as in Colorado in particular, because we are so dry. I know some of you have commented on that. Here in Colorado, others are being buried under feet of snow, and we've just had a couple dustings, and there's a couple more dustings coming this next week, but we really, really need much more. Simple Man says, thank you so much for all that you teach us. I've been watching you for a few years now and I've learned a lot. Started doing a lot of new things because of you. Thanks again. Well, I'm so glad to help out. And that's one reason why I do this. I noticed that the Kitchen Garden with Eli and Kate had signed on earlier today, and I want to give a shout out to them. And one reason I wanted to bring them up today is because they're a newer, smaller channel, and I think there's a lot of really good new small channels out there that you can get some really good information from. But it's interesting. We were actually sending some emails back and forth because they just produced a video yesterday on creating your own seed starting mix. And coincidentally, my next video coming out is starting your own seed starting mix. And so there's so much about gardening that it's the same information. The mix that Eli shows, that how they do it in her video, is very similar to the mix I'll be showing you how to do in my video. And this is one of those things, the reason that I encourage you to watch other channels, and to your point as to learning information about gardening. I love all of you are watching Gardener Scout, of course, but when you can find another channel that shows you the information of how to garden, and you start seeing that they're doing it the same way, and then you go to another channel like Tony at Simplify Gardening, and you see that he's doing it the same way, now you can get that reinforcement that maybe that's an idea that you can use in your garden. And so Eli shows you in their latest video how to make a simple seed starting mix, saves you a ton of money, gives you everything you need to start your seeds. I'll be showing you the same thing in my video coming out on Thursday. And so when you start getting these ideas reinforced by other channels, hopefully this will really help you move forward with your gardening. If you're overwhelmed, and I've had some comments this last week from viewers that are just feeling overwhelmed by gardening. And so I'm just suggesting, by all means, watch my videos and learn from my videos, but also seek out some of those other channels that can help not only substantiate what I'm saying, but also maybe give you some new ideas, some of the things that maybe I didn't think about in my video that you can discover in other videos. I just think the idea of just getting more and more information is really the way to do it. And here we have Yankee Sista. You've changed your name. I noticed this on your channel the other day. It's now Yankee Sista Homestead. So I think that is fantastic. And thank you so much. Always nice to have you here on Mondays. Started my milk jug sowing first year. Everyone stay safe. You stay safe as well. And so here's one on the milk jug sowing. I've noticed this week, I did a video on this a year ago. And this week I've seen at least 2 or 3 other channels that are showing how to do the same thing. This is one of those kind of ideas when we talk about when to start sowing seeds. you can start sowing your seeds in the middle of winter when it's still cold and snowy outside with the milk jug method that so many channels are showing. And there's some from last year and there's some from this year. And it's a nice thing to try. The idea being that some seeds, and I think this works better with perennials because it's really what it's designed for. Perennial seeds require cold temperatures to be able to germinate in spring. So if you put some potting soil in an old milk jug and put some seeds in that soil and put it outside in the winter, it's going to be exposed to those cold conditions. And then come springtime, as the soil in that milk jug warms up, those seeds will begin to germinate. They'll grow into plants. You can transplant those flowers into sections of your garden. And it's taken almost no effort at all because you just stuck it outside and let Mother Nature decide when those seeds were going to germinate. So that's another one of those things. I don't really categorize that in my primary 3 times of when I'm going to start seeds, but I do that. This year I didn't do it with the milk jugs. I just went out and sowed the wildflower and the perennial seeds directly onto the soil. Same thing's going to happen. As the snow melts, those seeds are going to settle into the soil. They're going to be exposed to the cold temperatures. In spring, they're going to warm up, and then I'll get some germination from the seeds. The big difference, and you'll probably see this, Yankee Sista, as well, the germination rates are usually not as good as you'll have if you start seeds indoors. That's another great reason why starting seeds indoors makes more sense, because you've got complete control over the temperature, you've got complete control over the soil and the moisture levels and the light levels, and you can expect to get better germination and better success with your plants by doing it indoors than by just openly sowing outside. But I love that you're experimenting with the milk jug because it's one of those ways to become a better gardener. And you may like doing it. I know some gardeners that do it every single year. They really like doing that type of sowing. Okay, let's go to Sally Merrill. Recently moved into a rental, discovered millions of rows of Sharon seeds. I've seeded several dozen. When is the best time to put into pots and outdoors? So this is another one of those plants. Rose of Sharon, you can direct sow those seeds outdoors in winter. You could do it in the milk jug method or just put them directly onto the soil because they'll be exposed to the conditions that will really help them germinate best. But I suppose this raises an interesting point because let's add a 4th category of when you can start the seeds. Most of our focus tends to be on our vegetable garden. But for those of us who are starting the seeds to put out into our landscape, the flowers, the shrubs, the fruit bushes, those typically take a pretty long time to germinate. And then once they've germinated, they usually take a pretty long time to grow indoors. And I'll add many herbs to this category. So lavender, for instance, rosemary, thyme, they can take a very long time to grow into a plant that is big enough for you to put outside. And so sometimes you'll see on the seed packet, I think I saw one recently for lavender, and it said start indoors 180 days before transplant. And that's because it just takes so long for it to germinate, often weeks for the seed to germinate. And then the plant grows so slowly that it's going to be months before you can put it outside. So just like the vegetable crops, you need to know about the seeds you're starting to get the best results. And that means doing some research. And so I honestly don't know off the top of my head how long it's going to take for the Rose of Sharon to germinate and grow. But if you're planning to put those into your garden this year, I would say go ahead and start. You can get specific guidance on when to put tomatoes and peppers and all the rest into your pots indoors. You don't often find that information with the perennial flowers because most people just go and buy them from the nursery. So I would say go ahead and start some now. Start keeping track of how long it takes to germinate, and then track how long that plant's going to grow. Worst case scenario, it does great and you end up with a pretty big plant that you have to have in a pretty big pot and then put it outside because the weather is too cold to be able to transplant it for a few months ahead of time. That's the worst case, is that it just gets too big indoors. More likely, it's going to take a long time to grow. So I would say go ahead and start some indoors now. Go ahead and sow some outdoors now, and then just start keeping track of how well it does. And that's one of those things that I haven't grown Rose of Sharon from seed. But once you have, then you start sharing that information with the rest of us, and we can learn from what you've learned. And so next year, if someone asks when you start Rose of Sharon seeds, I hope you're here to answer that question and help the rest of us out. I love Rose of Sharon, and it's on my list of plants to put in the garden, but I haven't bought seeds yet. So I'm actually going to write that down to remind myself. I've been meaning to get some Rose of Sharon seeds for a while. So thank you for that prompt. I've got it written down, and we'll go from there. So, okay. Kim Hamilton asked, do you add days for the seed to germinate to the 8 to 6 weeks the seed packet recommends, as some seeds can take 2 to 3 weeks to germinate according to the package? Good question. And so in my experience, that germination time is built into the recommendation. And so tomato seeds generally, at least in my soil, in my house, they'll be germinating in 4 days, maybe 5 days. So my tomato seeds are germinating within the first week. So when I start my tomato seeds 6 to 8 weeks as recommended on the seed packet, the first week is for germination. Peppers take longer. And so when it's recommended to start pepper seeds 8 to 10 weeks before you put them outside, well, it often takes 2 or 3 weeks for those pepper seeds to germinate. If you use a seed mat under your pepper seeds and under your tomato seeds, it will help to accelerate the germination. But if you're trying to start peppers in cool soil, the typical indoor household temperatures, don't be surprised if it doesn't take 2 to 3 weeks. And if you're trying to grow the hot chilies, it may take a month for those seeds to germinate. Much of that is built into the guidelines that the seed packets will tell you. And so the peppers that you start 10 weeks early and the tomatoes that you start 6 weeks early, the plants are going to be pretty close to the same size when they're ready to transplant. And a lot of that comes into how quickly they germinate and how quickly those seedlings can begin to grow. This is another factor when you are starting the seeds directly outdoors, is you do need to anticipate the time that it's going to take to germinate. Some seeds, radish seeds for instance, they'll germinate in a day or two. It's just crazy how fast some of those seeds can germinate. That all comes with experience. These are great things to put into a garden journal. And I'd highly suggest that when you start seeds, track it. And I'll do this on my calendar. This is another reason why I like my paper calendar. Is on, for instance, let's say March 25th, I write down that that's when I'm going to start my tomato seeds. Well, I'll keep track because I usually grow multiple varieties. So on March 29th, I'll write down that the celebrity tomato seeds germinated. And then on April 2nd, I'll write down that the black crim tomato seeds germinated. And these are the kind of things that you can use for the future. Once you figure out how long it takes for the seeds to germinate, you can then build it into your plan. Because if you like transplanting an 8-inch plant and you learn that it takes a whole week for the seeds to germinate, well, then you may need to actually start your plants 2 weeks earlier than recommended, just because that's how you like to garden. So don't feel like any of these are rules that you have to follow. These are guidelines that you can use to determine what works best for you and which methods you like. And so even with my tomato seeds, I'll start most of them on the same day. But I periodically, depending on the tomato, may start some earlier or start some later because I want a different size plant to either give away or put into a different part of my garden. So for instance, this year with my peppers, I'm planning on growing some hot chili peppers inside my greenhouse. Well, I can put those plants in the ground in my greenhouse before I would put those plants outside in the open garden because the soil won't have warmed as much there. So for those hot chili peppers that I'm going to be growing, I'll be starting those probably 3 weeks, maybe even 4 weeks earlier than all of my other pepper seeds, because I'll be able to put them into my greenhouse at least 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks earlier than all of the peppers that I'll be putting out into the garden. So this is, you can see how this can become complicated because you're playing with all these different numbers. The seed packet tells you one thing, your experience tells you another thing, and then what you want to do in a new season may be completely different. So be flexible. Be flexible with it. But yes, do realize that the germination of the seeds is going to influence how those seedlings grow and how quickly those seedlings grow, and then how quickly you can actually get those plants out into the garden. So Lisa Marie 719, a newbie question, can I use leftover seeds from last year? And that's a good question. I've actually got this video coming out. I was going to do it on Saturday, but I'm waiting for some of the germination results. I think I mentioned this a week ago. So this probably right now won't come out until a week from Thursday. And I have a video on this exact subject. How long do seeds last? And so to answer your question, in almost every case, yes, you can use the previous year's seeds. But if those seeds from the previous year were already 5 or 6 years old, then if you try them again this year, they'll be less viable. Every year that a seed ages, some of the seeds will lose their viability, and that's what I'll be talking about in the video to come. But as far as the ones, if you bought them last year, expect to use them this year. There are some that lose their viability pretty quickly, and this is what I'm testing right now, is onion seeds in particular have a pretty low viability rate. They don't last as long, whereas other seeds will germinate after 5 or 6 or 7 years with no problem whatsoever. So go ahead and reuse your seeds, and of course buy new seeds, because that's what we all do, right? Is buy more and more seeds and keep growing. Here's a good point. Sarah's Garden says, I direct sow beets as soon as the ground is workable. And so this gets back to the idea of the plants or the seeds that you're direct sowing for your spring and summer garden, and the soil temperature. There are some really wonderful sources out there, and you can find some in seed books, and you can also do a search for soil temperature in seeds, or when to start seeds. And when you look at soil temperature requirements for different seeds, this is also another great guideline as to whether you should go ahead and start them indoors or start them outdoors. And what you'll find on some of these charts that have been produced by different universities, and I think Rutgers University has a chart like this that you can find on their website with gardening and farming information. You'll find out that spinach seeds, for instance, can germinate in 35-degree soil. 35 degrees Fahrenheit is about 2 degrees Celsius. The seed will germinate. and start growing when the soil is that cold. And I think beets are in that general range. I think a beet seed can actually germinate when the soil temperature is between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 5 to 10 Celsius. That's cold. And so that's why we can actually get some of these seeds started when it is still cold outside. Now, they're not going to germinate quickly and they're not going to grow quickly, but the seeds can actually start growing. And to Zara's garden point, as soon as the soil is workable, and what that means is as soon as it's not frozen, that you can actually stick your finger in it or put your trowel and dig a hole. As soon as the soil is workable, that means it's not frozen anymore. It's above that point of 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can start sowing some of these really hardy plants that can handle the cold conditions. So I do the same thing. I like to start my beets. For me, my soil really isn't workable until the end of March or early April. But that's when I'm putting out my chard seeds and my beet seeds and my turnip seeds and my spinach seeds and my lettuce seeds and my radish seeds, because all of those seeds can germinate in cold soil. And so you can build that into your planting as well. But when you start learning more and more about the temperatures, you'll learn that the squash seeds and the melon seeds, they really need more like a 70 degree soil, that's 21 degrees Celsius, before those seeds will even consider germinating. And the warmer the soil, the faster those seeds will germinate. And so not all seeds are created equal. Some can last for years and germinate in extremely cold soil. Some need warm soil and only last for a couple years. And so this is why gardening can be so overwhelming and the information just seems like it's too much, because every plant is different. And that's why you've got to figure out which plants you like to grow, learn as much as you can about those seeds and those plants, and then learn something new, because you become an expert on the ones that you were growing in particular. So, okay, I'm scrolling down trying to catch up a little bit. Zara's Garden says seeds can last centuries when stored properly. Germination rates may go down as time passes, but there have been cases of seed sprouting after thousands of years. And so as you'll see in my video that I've got coming up, I've grown pepper seeds. I did a video about this, I think it was last year, where I showed how you can do your own germination test of your own seeds. And I had seeds that were 5 and 6 and 7 years old that still gave me very good germination rates. Not 100%. Some of those seeds aren't going to last forever. But even with those seeds that were thousands of years old, they found seeds in the pyramids in Egypt, and seeds that were buried in pouches up in Scandinavia. Some of those seeds have survived hundreds or thousands of years and were still germinated in ideal conditions. These aren't the kind of seeds that you probably would be able to find buried somewhere after a couple hundred years and put them in your basement grow room and expect them to grow. Most of these were really grown in under scientific, perfect conditions, and then the germination happened. But yeah, it can definitely be done. But that point is extremely valid. Store them correctly, and you can expect your seeds to last for a very long time. And so what does that mean? A cool, dry, dark location, and you can reuse your seeds year after year. And then when you start noticing reduced germination rates, well, you can still plant a seed that is old. You might only have 50% germination rate. Well, just sow twice the amount of seed and you'll get what you're used to. So if you're used to sowing 50 carrot seeds and having close to 100% germination, well, carrots are only expected to last about 3 to 4 years. And if at the 5-year point you still have some carrot seeds, go ahead and sow 150 carrot seeds and see what kind of germination rates you get. And don't be surprised if you don't end up with 50 carrots after sowing that many. Okay, I'm scrolling down trying to catch up. Let's see. Nice to see so much of this information going back and forth. Riverdale is saying, I always wanted to try grafting some tomatoes onto Maxifort rootstock. Never seemed to have time or patience, just for a fun experiment. Anybody ever do this? That's a good question, and I'll scroll down to see if anybody else has comment on it. I have the same thought process. To me, it's just as easy to start a seed indoors and then put the plant outdoors and hope for the best. I will at some point in the future do some grafting of tomatoes. It's extremely easy to do, and it's a great thing to expand your gardening knowledge, but I haven't done it. And if anyone else has done it, by all means, share that with River and Dale. But yeah, that would be a good experiment. Mornings at the Allotment says, I don't direct sow much because my allotment plot is riddled with weeds and I can't afford the amount of compost I would need to really deal with that. We're no dig. And that's a really good point. I actually hadn't even really thought about that as part of the discussion today. I use this as an answer. So I have a video a few years old, actually I think it's almost 4 years old now, where I talk about how to grow tomatoes. And I show the process of transplanting tomatoes from the seed in the small cell into a 3-inch pot. And then from a 3-inch pot, it goes into a 5-inch pot. And then from a 5-inch pot, it goes into a gallon pot. And I am invariably asked the question about, do you have to do that? Do you have to go from seed to pot to a bigger pot to a bigger pot? And no, you really don't. And the reason I showed that in the video that was at the Galileo School was because we were growing thousands of plants and we were limited in space. We couldn't start all of our seeds in big pots because we just didn't have the space for it. So we had to sequence our growing and start some plants in smaller containers and then move them up to bigger containers. And then that freed up some space under the lights to start more seeds. And then we could move plants out to the greenhouse. And that's why we did it. Well, if you don't have an operation like that, you don't have to follow that kind of guidance. You can go directly into a medium-sized pot or a big pot and then transplant that out into the garden. But even that medium-sized pot or that big pot requires potting soil. And if you don't have the space for those bigger pots, or as Mornings at the Allotment is saying, the amount of the compost or the amount of the potting soil to fill those, yeah, by all means, direct sow. That actually is one of the reasons I don't start my squashes and my lettuce indoors, because I think it's kind of a waste of potting soil or compost. I think that you can start those outside in your plot that's already been prepared. The soil is ready. You don't need to spend the expense on a soil and a container indoors. If you've got the time and the space, by all means, go directly outside. So I think that's a good decision on your part. And that is one of those considerations when we're starting our seeds and choosing when to start our seeds, is whether you can even do it at all indoors and whether you can have better results if you go outside. Okay, let's see. Bettina Whitmire saying, Maritime Gardening direct sows his tomatoes. He did experiment with transplants, direct sow, caught up and outperformed. He's in Nova Scotia. Sometimes it works out to experiment. And Maritime Gardening actually has some good information out there. I didn't know that he did the direct sowing. I hadn't seen a video on that. But that's to the point that if your conditions can handle what the plant needs, definitely go for it. And Nova Scotia in Canada, especially if you're in a greenhouse, can give you some of those sustained conditions to allow you to grow some of those plants. I may go ahead, actually hadn't planned on doing this, but now that we're having this discussion, I think I may go ahead and try direct sowing some pepper seeds in my greenhouse this year and see what happens. I think that's a good idea for an experiment. I'm in that mindset that it takes a certain amount of time for the peppers to grow, and I just don't have that much time unless I start them indoors. But I think my greenhouse may give me better options as far as extending the growing season. So add that to my list of things to start doing. So Jennifer Segrist is asking, who's the background so pretty with the snow? So this comes from Celeste Kawilak, and this is actually a few weeks old. So even though it would match what many of you are seeing in your yards right now, this is actually from a storm, one of the bigger storms that we had a few weeks ago. And I'm not sure if you remember that green shed. I'm pretty sure we showed this during the summertime when these plants were growing. But Celeste sent this picture, and it really is a beautiful setting. And so what I really wanted to point out in this picture today is just how beautiful the garden can look in winter. I really love the way my garden looks in winter. Now, one of the things that I like, that I think really adds to it, you can see all of the outdoor patio stuff right here, and you know that's always nice when there's I'm trying to lean the right way, when there's snow. But as you start looking back here next to this shed and you start seeing some of the beds and some of the plants, it really adds some nice texture to the scene. You know, over here, these are all boxy and square. But now when you look back here, you start seeing some curves and some points. And when you get back over here and you start looking at all these cattle panel hoops, it really adds, I think, a nice visual element. The curves of the trellises in your garden and the way the snow falls, the way that the ice sits on it. I just think that's really nice. And if you can have a beautiful backdrop like this with all the trees, that really makes for a nice wintry scene. So this, I guess the nice thing about taking pictures of your garden in winter is you can't see all the weeds and you can't see how things are dead underneath. You just focus on the snow and how pretty the snow is. I'm actually waiting for the snow to come and help cover up some of the areas of my garden that don't look so nice. But I really like this background as well, and it really is appropriate for many of us at this time. So thank you, Celeste, for sending this. And if you want me to show your background, send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. One of the things I also wanted to talk about this picture, and maybe there's too much snow right now in particular to really identify, but during the winter, and I've said this before, the winter is a great time to get out into your garden and see it at its barest. You can see the bare bones of your garden, and it can really help identify for you what you need to do as far as adding more beds or moving beds or adding plants or taking down plants. And so in this, I think there's a really nice balance. You know, there's the patio over here, there's the garden over here, and you can see how well balanced it is in this picture. In the summertime, you're going to have probably not much over here other than when they come out to their patio and that's their barbecue grill right there. But over here, this is all going to be green and growing. So it's really going to become the dominant feature in the yard in the summertime. But in the winter, when you can see that balance and you can see the bare bones of your garden, take a look. And it might give you some ideas for planning if you are thinking in terms of adding to your garden and trying new things. So yeah, I think that's a really nice background, and I'm glad I was able to share it. Brian says, last year I planted some 3-inch tomato plants. My neighbor planted his 4-inch plants about the same time. His plants did fine and dandy, although they never did catch up to mine. That's a good point, and it gets back to the idea of you don't need to plant a 3-foot tall tomato plant to get good tomatoes. You can often plant a smaller pot with a smaller plant, and as long as you've got that initial start, as long as your soil is good and ready to support the plant, it can easily overtake someone else who would put a bigger plant in the ground if they're not taking the same time to prepare. So good for you. And I've seen that many times as well. The plants, once most of these plants that we're growing are exposed to the sun and to our care, they're going to grow quickly. And I've seen that with the tomato plants I've grown as well. I remember one year at the Galileo School, we had the 6-inch tomato plants, but we had also started many others much earlier. And so we were putting in 6-inch tomato plants, and we were putting in 12-inch tomato plants. And we actually had a few beds where the very first tomatoes that were in the greenhouse were about 18 inches tall when we put those into the garden. By the end of the season, you couldn't tell which ones were the small ones and which ones were the big ones. The small ones had caught up with the big ones, and all the tomato plants looked like everything else. So I wouldn't be too focused on trying to grow a big plant. Try to grow a strong plant, a healthy plant, and a small healthy plant will do better in your garden than a tall, spindly, weak plant. So we'll be talking much more about that in the weeks ahead, of actually how to get the strongest plants and some of the tips you can do when your seedlings emerge. We're still focused on seeds. I'm planning we'll talk next week on some more seed ideas too. But then we'll get into seedlings and start talking about what we're going to do for the seedlings as well. So, okay, I'm scrolling down. I know I'm way behind with some of the things that you guys are mentioning. So I'm going to scroll down, see what else we have. Mary Bear in Maine is saying, can you talk about fertilizing or not fertilizing young seedlings? Yes, no, when, what? And so this is actually one of the topics that is in that video that Eli and Kate just did, and that I'll be doing here in a couple days. A lot of it depends on the phase that the plant is growing in. And so for seeds, you don't need any fertilizer at all. And so a seed starter mix is often just a basic non-fertile growing medium. It's going to be peat or cocoa coir and perlite or vermiculite. And typically that's it. Those are the only ingredients. Go to the store, you'll see this in my video. Go to the store and look at the ingredients on a seed starter mix. That's all you're going to see. You're not going to see fertilizers because a seed has everything it needs to begin growing. But a seed starter mix has no nutrition. So if you're limited in your funds, or if you're not fully sure of when you need to transplant, you can grow your plants in a seed starter mix. But realize it has no nutrients. So you're going to have to add all of the nutrients for that plant. If you have your seedlings growing in a seed starter mix and they're getting big and you haven't transplanted, it's time to fertilize. Don't use a full strength fertilizer when you're fertilizing seedlings. You really want to cut it down, weaken it, at least 50% of fertilizer to 50% extra water. It can even be weaker than that depending on the size of the plant, because those small plants don't need a lot of nutrition. But that's one case that you would need to fertilize. If your plants are still growing in a seed starter mix and that medium has no nutrition. If you started your seeds in potting soil, which I don't always recommend because potting soil tends to be denser and the roots have difficulty growing in a potting mix. So, and here's a great experiment I would encourage that you do. Take seeds, the same type of seed, start them in a seed starter mix and start some in a potting soil, and note the difference. And you should see that the seeds in the seed starter mix, those seedlings will grow faster and probably grow better than the seeds that are trying to grow in the potting mix. I know it's a bit of a dichotomy, because what do we do with the seeds that are in the seed starter mix? Well, we transplant them into a potting mix, because the potting mix is where the nutrition is. And so back to this question about the fertilizer, it depends on the potting mix. I make my potting mix with compost and worm castings in most cases. And the compost and the worm castings are providing enough nutrition for my plants that I don't need fertilizer. So I rarely fertilize my seedlings unless I notice that they're really suffering, and then I'll use a diluted fertilizer for my seedlings. I think this is one of those things that too often we're just told that we need to fertilize our seedlings when they're growing. It's unnecessary. But if you're using a good potting soil, it probably has the nutrition in it. If you are using a store-bought potting soil, read the ingredients, and I did this for the video I'll be coming out with at the end of the week on Saturday on potting soil mixes. If you look at the bags of potting soil mixes that you'll buy at the big box stores or the nurseries, all of them have fertilizer already in that potting soil. And it's usually in the granular form. Those little balls that are in the potting mix are the fertilizer. But if you are buying your potting soil, it already has fertilizer in it as well. So again, no reason to fertilize the seedlings because the potting soil already has it in it. If you're making your own potting soil and reusing it year after year without replenishing the compost or the worm castings, then you need to consider the possibility of adding a weakened fertilizer for those seedlings because the medium has depleted some of the nutrients that were in it over the course of years as those plants were growing. So, hope that helps answer that question, because as far as yes, no, when, what, in almost every case, the seeds that I'm growing is a no. I just don't fertilize my young seedlings because I know that the potting soil has the nutrition that those seedlings need. If you know they don't, then it becomes more of a wait until they start growing. And, just a general guideline, when they get about their third or fourth set of leaves, that's when you can maybe consider start adding some extra fertilizer if you notice that the plants aren't doing well. But the seed initially has all the energy to produce a seedling, and the soil should be enough to promote a potting soil, should be enough to promote the second and third set of leaves. But that's when it's really going to have a root system that is seeking out more nutrients to give a burst of energy. And so that's why about that point I would add fertilizer if I determined I needed to add fertilizer. So I hope that helps. I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking, but I may have saved you some money. You don't have to buy the fertilizer and some time because you don't have to apply the fertilizer in those kinds of situations. So, okay, Lisa Lewis is saying, this year we know not to buy so much compost or dirt. Last year we almost broke our trailer axle. That's good. So if you've got your beds all ready to go and you've got your compost and soil in those beds, save yourself some effort this year. This will be the first year now this will be my third season of growing. This is the first year I'm not planning on buying soil because I've had enough delivered that I've been able to fill my beds and fill out the areas where I needed some soil. So we're in that same boat. It gets old shoveling and moving the soil and the compost all over the garden. It's nice when things get built. Urban Chicken Mama, happy Monday to you. I'm about to start asparagus for the first time. How deep should the bed be? It's going to be there for a long time. And I have a video that shows exactly how to do this, how to actually grow asparagus in a raised bed. Did this a couple years ago. And in that video, I talk about the depth. So there's a couple different ways you can approach it. But the idea is deep. Go ahead and think in terms of digging 12 to 18 inches deep and have it nice, rich soil. You can see the whole progress and process that I do in that video. And I'll have an update video this year where I talk about how to tend to the asparagus and harvest the asparagus a couple years after planting, because it's going to take at least 2 years 3 seasons before you harvest your asparagus. And I'm just now approaching that in my garden, so really looking forward to having some fresh asparagus. But it's deep, and you want them to be about 18 inches apart from each other, all those little root crowns that you're putting in the ground, about 18 inches apart, because they're going to be in the ground for 15 years and more, and they'll gradually fill in that space. And so that's why I did the video of putting them into a low raised bed, because they can easily escape to another area of your garden if you just put them in open ground, which may be what you want. If you want them to really fill out an area over the course of years, they will definitely fill out an area, assuming it's a nice rich soil and it's conditions that they like. And so it's a long-term plan, but it's also one of those things you should start as soon as possible. So if you're thinking at all about growing asparagus, because of the bed preparation, and because you've got to wait a couple years before you even get your first harvest, and because it's going to take a long time for the bed to fill out, go ahead and get started right away. And like I said, that video I have really gives some good guidance on how to plant. You can either dig a big hole, dig a trench, put it in, and then fill the bed on top of it. I talk about all of that in that video and show those different methods, as I used a couple different ways to fill my bed. Craig Humphreys, good afternoon or evening to you, and so nice to see that contribution. I really appreciate that. Happy to finally catch another live stream while you're live. Always enjoy your videos. Best wishes, and best wishes back to you, Craig. It's so nice to see you here, and I appreciate the support. That's very nice. Jonna is saying, I have both pumpkin and watermelon seeds that I saved from last year's fruit. My last frost date is the last week of April, and I'm in zone 6. When should I start these seeds? And so this is actually a really good question, and I touched on it briefly at the beginning. Yeah, you have to understand how the plant grows and how quickly the plant grows. And so for most of the squashes and melons, you're only going to be starting them about 3 weeks before you put them outdoors. Because once they germinate and start growing, they grow very quickly. And they can easily become root bound in a little pot if you start them any earlier than that. So about 3 weeks is the target I use when I put squash plants out. Now, back to the point that we were talking earlier about comparing plants. This last year, I started some butternut squash indoors about 3 weeks early. And then when I put them out in the garden, that same day that I put those plants in the garden, I planted the same butternut squash seeds side by side in the same bed as an experiment to see if the seeds would catch up. And they almost caught up. I harvested the butternut squash seed or butternut squash from the plants that I started 3 weeks early. I harvested those squash almost 3 weeks before I harvested the squash from the ones that I direct sowed the seed. Now, my garden, as short as the season is, there's enough time for me to grow butternut squash and zucchini and a lot of those type of plants. So my experiment this last year showed that if you start your plants 3 weeks early, you'll be harvesting 3 weeks early, because the clock is a little bit different in those plants that grow so quickly. So if you transplant a squash or a melon seed outside, that plant that you're transplanting, it is already actively growing, and it will continue to grow very, very quickly. It's the slower growing plants like the peppers and the eggplant and the tomatoes that we really want to put a plant out, and the clock doesn't start until that plant is out. It's a little bit modified for those fast growing ones. So if you need an extra 3 weeks, start 3 weeks early. You can maybe go to 4 weeks early on those plants, but I would definitely grow them in one of those biodegradable containers that you can just plop straight in the ground because you don't want to damage the roots if you can avoid it, or be growing those seeds in a bigger pot and then put that whole root ball into the ground to avoid damaging the roots. But if you've got that extra 3 weeks, just go ahead and direct sow, and as I've experienced, you'll have similar results as well. So Doris says, I watched your video on winter sowing. I live in Denver but want perennial flowers on my land in Bailey, Colorado at 8,000 feet. Do they need to be germinated there, or can I do them in Denver? Oh, great question. And this actually holds true for everything that you're going to be starting from seed indoors or winter sowing in a milk jug. You can start it wherever you are and transplant it to another garden and put it into another garden. Absolutely. Even though the conditions of that other garden may be different, you can still grow a plant in one place and move it to another place. That's what all of the nurseries are doing. When you buy a plant from your garden center, it wasn't grown there. It may have been grown 1,000 miles away, then ported, and then you bought it. Before you put it into your garden in Bailey, Colorado, I would harden it off. I would get it acclimated to that garden. And so go ahead and start it in Denver, move it to Bailey, but before you put it in the ground in Bailey, give it as long as you can. And I've got videos on hardening off, but at least 3 days up to a week, so that it can get used to the higher altitude, the more intense sun, the colder nights. All of those are important factors before you put those plants into the ground. And that should be the way to get the best results. With flowers, it's not as important as with vegetables. That's why I say 3 days for flowers is often all you really need for hardening off. But do give those flowers some time to get used to the new conditions as opposed to whatever the protected conditions were that you were growing in Denver. So, okay, scrolling down again. John Ann is saying, my first year of tomato growing, I did them in the cups, but with seed starting mix only. I like the layered idea. Now I grow thousands for sale, so I do them very differently. Awesome. I'm guessing, I talk about this in the video I did last year with the layering idea, where you can start the seed in a seed starting mix, recognize that the roots need to be growing in potting soil, and you can do all that in the same container. And so you have the potting soil in the lower 3/4 or 5/6 of the pot, and then you have the seed starting mix at the top. And so the seed germinates in the seed starter mix, and then the roots start growing into the potting soil. And that actually is an easy way to not have to worry about transplanting. So I'm guessing that's some of the conversation that's been going back and forth. And I talk about that in that video because it can be a very effective way to get the best of both worlds of the seed starting mix and the potting soil without having to worry about the repotting. So thanks, John Ann, for pointing that out, and glad to hear that you're growing thousands now. That's incredible. That's really fantastic. Novak 23, would it be good enough seed starter mix using a biogreen compost with Adapulgite? I don't know that. Palygorskite, I don't know that either. Adding a scoop from forest topsoil is a good idea. And so again, the idea of a seed starter mix, it should be loose so that the young, small roots can easily grow through it. It should be well draining so that those little roots don't become waterlogged and drown. And that's really the only requirement for a seed starter mix. So if you use anything else, and so for instance, a biogreen compost, by itself, like I said, I don't know those extra ingredients that are being added, or a forest topsoil. Those will have wonderful nutrition, but it's going to take longer for that little seedling to actually grow because the roots are going to have to fight against that denser material. So the idea behind the seed starter mix is a light, loose material just to get those roots growing and to get that little seedling off to a great start. Not required. You could easily grow it in forest topsoil with compost and expect that most of the plants we're growing will probably do pretty well. One of the issues that you might have, depending on the forest material in particular, is that there are going to be natural fungi and bacteria that's going to be in that medium. Damping off disease, I haven't had problems with damping off disease in years and years and years because I use my own sterile mixes to start, with the exception of the worm castings that's alive with bacteria. But I'm not introducing anything that might have fungal spores in it, because damping off disease, along with a lot of other seedling diseases, are caused by a number of different fungi. And so it's possible, if you're using something from the forest floor, that it could have, well, it will have a fungal spore in it, because there are fungal spores all throughout the forest. But it's possible that there could be some harmful spores in that mix to harm your seedlings. So I would just caution you against that. But yes, you could use that as a seed starter mix. Just realize that the seeds are going to struggle a little bit more. They'll do fine. All those seeds we start directly into our garden, they're not being started in seed starter mix. They're being started in garden soil. And they germinate and they grow. It's just under the controlled conditions of what we're doing inside. Why not give them the best start possible? That's why we typically recommend the seed starter mix. But yes, absolutely. You could start it directly into a potting soil of all kinds of different blends and expect they would grow. Just be aware of the possible fungal problems and deal with it if it happens. Hopefully you won't have those issues. Or you could sterilize that material before you put the seeds in it, but then you're not going to be getting any benefit of the bacteria that is in that natural occurring medium as well. So it's a balance. This might be one of those good ideas to experiment. Try it, see if you like it, compare it to other type of mixes, see if you like those better or worse, and that'll help answer your question. So, okay, let's see. I saw Craig Humphreys. Thank you for that super chat. I really appreciate it. I'm currently caring for 3 rescue hedgehogs. That's fantastic. I like that idea. They are great at pest control, but I learned that their poop can contain parasites that are transmissible to humans. Is that a problem that you know of? So yes, and actually, this will lead into the end of the show here in just a little bit. But the manures, the poop from the animals in our garden, for the most part, if you're going to use manure, try to use manure from an animal that has a plant-based diet exclusively. So that's why horses and cows and sheep and alpaca and rabbit manures and chicken manures are used in gardens, because those are 100% plant-based diets, and you're not going to find the problems that you will find in animals that have a more varied diet. And so I believe a hedgehog is an omnivore, so it's out there eating a lot of things. But this is why you're not going to use cat poop or dog poop or pig poop in your garden, because yes, they can contain not only parasites but pathogens that can be harmful for humans. And though I can't speak specifically to hedgehogs because I don't have the experience with the hedgehogs, that would be my assumption and what you've heard. Because they're an omnivore, because they're eating lots of things crawling around in addition to whatever plants they might be eating, there is that potential for parasites to be spread through their manure into the garden. So if you've heard that, that's probably where it comes from. It's based on their diet, and if their diet or and their gut would have parasites in it, then that parasite's going to be pooped out. And it's very easily something that you could pick up if you are using it in the garden and you get exposed to it. So I might suggest that in the area where you know the hedgehogs are actively living, and I'm not sure if you're just helping them in their natural habitat or if you're actually having them in some type of structure, wear gloves. Just wear some rubber gloves and or at the very least some leather gloves, and that can help mitigate some of those issues if you're aware that there are parasites or pathogens. Just try to avoid the skin contact with it. So it would not surprise me that hedgehogs would have that problem. It is one of those things that the pathogens and the parasites that are in many of those animals, if it's exposed to the soil and if they come into your garden, sure, yes. And I know I've heard of stories, I don't actually know any people, but I've heard of stories where the cats pooped in their garden and they were gardening and they ended up with a parasite through the cat poop. I've heard of those stories. Well, gloves are a way to mitigate that. Over time, those parasites that live in the gut of a cat or a hedgehog, chances are they can't live in the soil, so they're going to die. And they're going to be eaten by a lot of those soil organisms that we like to have in our soil. So over time, it won't be a problem. It's just the fresh poop that's probably the issue that you need to be aware of, and that's probably what you should try to protect yourself from. So hope that helps. Sorry, we don't have hedgehogs here, and so that's why I don't have any experience with hedgehogs. I think hedgehogs are a really cool animal. We do have a small type of hedgehog here in the States that people will have as a pet, but and I suppose it's possible. I'm trying to remember. I lived in New England for a while, but I don't know of any native hedgehogs that we might have in New England. But it's a wonderful animal, and I'm glad that you are encouraging them and trying to make sure that they're nice and healthy. The problem I'm concerned about is that they leave their manure where they eat. This is usually in my veg bed, so there's direct contact with the food. I would be concerned about that. You can, if you don't want them in your veg bed, you can try to take some of those precautions, like fencing it or laying some wire on the surface of the soil, or maybe using a thick woody mulch that might help. But in that case, and so the parasites could be transferred to you through the skin contact with their droppings, which is where the gloves come in. So definitely in your veg bed, wear the gloves. The pathogens, if it was E. coli that was being spread through the droppings, that could be on your veg as you harvest it. If it's mostly the parasites that you're concerned about, I wouldn't be concerned about the parasites being transferred to any of the veg. So the soil in your veg beds is probably going to be contaminated by any parasites. If you can, I might suggest taking one of the hedgehogs to a veterinarian and having the veterinarian do an exam to find out if the hedgehogs have any issues. Or you might be able to take some of the droppings to a veterinarian to do a test under a microscope, and they might be able to tell you if there are any parasites. Maybe that can help you relieve some of your concerns. But until then, wear gloves. Maybe try to keep them out of the veg beds unless you're specifically trying to get them there to eat the bugs, which is a good thing. And wash all the veg that you harvest to wash off any parasites before they get to your skin. But I'm not aware of any of those animal-based parasites that are going to be burrowing into a carrot, and then you eat the carrot, and then you've got that parasite. That's typically not the way it works. But there are a couple of courses that you might be able to take and see if maybe you can get a veterinarian involved. Maybe they can help answer that question a little bit. So hedgehogs, good information on hedgehogs today. Wish I could be more specific for you, but that is how we handle the problem with cats, for instance. If you're a gardener with a cat in your garden, and believe me, it's happened to me, that is so disgusting to be digging in your garden and discover what the cat has buried for you to find. That is just disgusting. I try to wear gloves as much as possible because of that. And anytime you know that you've got that problem, wearing gloves is a good idea to mitigate those kind of problems. And it shouldn't be an issue. I bet you can find a happy balance where you can wear gloves and allow the hedgehogs in your veg bed, and then just wash the veg very well when you harvest, and it may be a non-issue completely. So let's hope that's actually the course of action that works best for you, if you don't want to actually get scientific and find out through their droppings what they actually have. Just do some mitigation methods and it should work out pretty well. So, okay, so real quick, Mayor Bear's asking, do you do any soil blocking, pros and cons suggestions? I have a video, it's also a few years old, I think it's about 3 years old, on soil blocking. And I do some soil blocking. Soil blocking is real nice because you just make a block out of soil and put your seed in it and don't worry about a pot. So the pros are that you're not spending any money on pots, and they can go directly into the garden when it comes time to transplant, and you can create the perfect soil for blocking. So there are some pros to it. The cons are that you have to be more aware of how you water your plants, because I did this at the school. We did soil blocking at the Galileo School, and one day in particular, some of the kids were watering the seedlings, and they took a watering can and just poured it directly on top of those soil blocks, which dissolved all the soil blocks and exposed all the roots, and the little plants suffered. So you do have to be aware that watering is different. You can't just do normal overhead watering because it'll break apart the soil block in most cases. And the type of plant will determine whether it's successful or not, particularly if you're growing a bigger plant. Well, once the plant gets big enough and those roots get big enough, that soil block may not be big enough to support the weight and growth of the plant, and it falls over and the soil block falls apart. So in those cases, if you're growing bigger plants, you really should be growing them in a pot. But for soil blocks to start, and then take those soil blocks and put them into a bigger pot before putting them outside, that's how I typically do it. I'll start with smaller soil blocks and then transplant those into a pot. And then when the plant in the pot gets bigger, that's when I put it outside. So you can see my recipe and how I do soil blocks in that video that's a few years old, and maybe that'll help answer some of your questions. Oh, there you go. Jay's right on top of things with a link to the soil block video. Thanks, Jay. I appreciate Jay and Heidi so much. They're always right on top of things. Oh, there's an answer from Charles. The adipolgite is an oral non-absorbed medication that's used in the management of diarrhea. It works by bonding to bacteria and toxins, reducing the loss of water. Interesting. I had no idea. So I'm going to have to go ahead and review some of this to make sure that I didn't miss anything. And Kathy's saying, do you mean just vinyl rubber gloves, or will regular garden gloves be adequate? So regular garden gloves should be good to protect you from any droppings in the soil. And so in just general gardening, regular garden gloves are good. I use leather gloves, a light or like a calf skin leather a lot of times. But if you know that you've got hedgehogs or cats, and you are pretty sure that they have parasites or pathogens, then I would suggest going with the rubber gloves or rubberized garden gloves. Those would work too. The cloth garden gloves that have the rubberized surface to them, where you're in the palm and the fingers, those should be good enough as well. And so better safe than sorry. And I know a lot of people want to protect their skin and they wear those gloves anyway. So That would be a good way to think about it. So since we're talking about manures, and specifically the hedgehog manure, but this holds true in the case of a lot of other manures, at the garden club meeting that I talked about that we had a couple days ago, one of the women gave a presentation. And so in our garden club, what we've started doing is having the members of the club give an educational presentation at the end of the meeting. In years past, and many other garden clubs will pay someone to come in and give a presentation. And I've spoken to many garden clubs in the area. In fact, in about 6 weeks, I'm giving a presentation to the Colorado Federation of Garden Clubs, because they pay people to come talk about gardening. And I'll gladly go anywhere and talk about gardening, especially if they want to pay me for it. Well, at our garden level, or garden club level, we decided to have our own club members give presentations. Yes, it saves some of our membership dues that we might have paid for somebody else. But more importantly, and this is the point I really want to make, I think the best way to learn how to garden is to teach someone else how to garden. And so this woman in particular, this new gardener, the kind of gardener that at our garden club meetings every month, she asks basic questions, the kind of questions that a brand new gardener would ask, because she's a brand new gardener. And she was the first to start this year in January giving a presentation on manures and fertilizers, because she didn't know much about using manures in the garden as fertilizers. So she spent a month from the December meeting to the January meeting learning about manures, learning about nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, learning about how the different types of manures have different nutrient levels, which manures were considered hot manures, which were cold manures, which were best for the vegetable gardens, which ones might have pathogens and parasites. She learned all that and then gave us a presentation on it. And I specifically asked her at the end of the meeting, did you learn something about gardening and fertilizers? And she said, oh, yes, absolutely. She learned so much because she had to teach others about that subject. And so, I said it before, I'll say it again. The best way to learn about gardening is to teach someone else about gardening. Now, that someone else doesn't necessarily have to be a gardener. Just is you sharing your information verbally so that you can reinforce what you've learned for yourself, and then maybe recognize, based on any questions they might ask you, the deficiencies in your knowledge. And this really took me to a completely new level of gardening. I was a master gardener. I'd been teaching classes for 10 years when I got hired to set up and run and build the Galileo School Garden. I knew a lot about gardening, but as soon as those students started asking me questions after I gave a presentation, after I showed them how to do something, after I demonstrated a gardening method, they would ask questions that were totally unexpected. Most of the time I had an answer, didn't necessarily have the best answer, but there were quite a few times that I was asked a very basic question by a brand new gardener, a student, and I didn't know the answer. I had no clue what the right answer was, which meant I had to go learn more about that subject. And that's why I said that it took me to a whole new level, because I really thought I knew a lot about gardening. But when you're dealing with a bunch of 10 and 11-year-olds asking you questions about gardening, you realize pretty quickly how little you know about gardening. So it really forced me to learn much more than I ever had before. So as I began teaching classes, my classes were at a higher level because I had more information to give. And that's the time when I really started getting involved with the YouTube videos, was about that time when I recognized that a lot of the other videos I was seeing on YouTube didn't have enough information. They didn't include what I needed to know, which really meant I had to buy more books and find more blogs and find better videos. And in my case, I decided to start making the videos with the information that I couldn't find elsewhere. And in the 4 or 5 years since that point, when I really started making more videos, it raised me up to a completely new level. So here, every Monday, the questions you ask, yes, in many cases, I know the answer because I've been doing this for 30 years and I've really been focused on the learning part of it for 15 years. But I still get stymied occasionally by a question. And so particularly like with hedgehogs, I'm going to go learn more about hedgehogs because I recognize I don't know enough about hedgehogs in the garden. There are those kind of things. When you have to try to answer somebody else, when you have to try to explain what you know to somebody else, it really brings out a whole new level of information, kind of information that really will take you to a new level. So I encourage you to find somebody to teach gardening to. It doesn't have to be today, it doesn't have to be next week, but during the course of this year, this gardening season, or if you're concluding your garden season, find somebody to tell about the lessons you've learned. Find somebody to show what it is that you know, and you will be a better gardener as a result of it. And you will know more as you reach that point of preparing to tell somebody else what it is you know, because nobody wants to look stupid. So you got to try to learn as much as you can, anticipating their questions, and then you take their questions and go back to the studies and learn more about it. So there you have it. That's how we're going to finish today. Teach someone about gardening and it will make you a better gardener. Great to have you here today. Great to see you. We'll see you again next week. Same time, same channel. We'll talk some more about seeds and we'll start talking about more of keeping those seedlings growing after they've germinated. I'll see you then. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.